Hello. I'd like to, is it working? Okay. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening for a talk by the British architect Amanda Levete of Amanda Levete Architects, or ALA. But first, there are a few announcements to be made about a few upcoming events as part of our larger public lecture series here at the GSD. Please join us tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. right here in Piper for our annual John T. Dunlop lecture with Raphael Bostic, who is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Raphael will be discussing the future of fair housing, as this year marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And then again on Thursday at April the 12th at noon in Gund 123, there's going to be a lecture by architect Eric Perry. He's going to deliver a lecture entitled Webs, Plates, Fists, and Gloves, Designing with Metals in Architecture. So it's truly an honor to be able to introduce Amanda Levete this evening to the GSD community. Amanda is founder and principal of ALA, an international award-winning design and architecture studio in London. Levete studied architecture at the Architectural Association and worked for Richard Rogers before joining Future Systems as a partner in 1989. At Future Systems, she realized groundbreaking buildings, including the Media Center at Lord's Cricket Ground and Selfridges department store in Birmingham. Here, I would like to underscore the term groundbreaking and to situate her work in the context of an architectural discourse at the time. In the mid-90s, while American academics and architects wrote and debated blobs and digital processes, something else was happening in the United Kingdom. Levete's practice was realizing a new architecture with double curvature, complex geometries, and abandoning architecture's modernist paradigms of the past. She challenged architecture's fabrication and constructability and ultimately its image. Since its formation in 2009, ALA has completed projects at the Victoria and Albert Museum, in 2017 in London, the V&A's largest building project in over 100 years. The MAAT, a Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon in 2016, commissioned by the EDP, one of the world's foremost energy companies. The Central Embassy in 2017, a 1.5 million square foot luxury shopping mall and hotel in Bangkok on the former grounds of the British Embassy. And then a 13-hectare media campus master plan and the headquarters building for Sky in 2016 in London, and the MPavilion in 2015 in Melbourne. While it is evident that architecture and the practice of building is at the core of ALA, other design works such as lighting, seating, shelving, cutlery, tables, and furniture allow the studio to advance form, material, and fabrication, which has direct impacts back on her architecture. One additional distinction that I would like to make about her work would be about the role of architectural effects in the real. When fully constructed and inhabitable, meaning real glass, real cladding, real surfaces, real mass, her architecture reads less like a building and more akin to a digital rendering. I believe to make the real appear unreal is no easy task. Fueled by imagination, rigorous detailing, and a conceptual attitude towards materiality, examples of these architectural effects include thousands of glittery discs glowing in the context of Birmingham's industrial city, or the elongated landform, plinth, and window massing that reflects a Lisbon waterfront, or the insertion of a pleated plaza into the Grade 1 listed V&A Museum. All of her architecture fits into its immediate context, but suggests a new, incredible, culturally engaging world unto itself. Levete's accomplishment in contemporary architecture can be noted by the many awards she's received, including the 2018 Jane Drew Prize for Women in Architecture a CBE, which I'm going to spell this out, it's Commander of the British Empire, in recognition of her services to architecture recognized by the Queen of England, and an RIBA Stirling Prize in 1999. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Levete.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I was actually here more than 25 years ago with my former partner, Jan Kaplitsky, and we came to give a talk, and they'd forgotten that it was like the day beforehand in, and there was just a handful of people, and it was so difficult. But here I am back in a new guise as principal of my own office. I say my own office, but I have 3 directors from 3 different continents. We're 50 people, it's a very collaborative place. And for me, this slide speaks of who we are and the culture of our office. It's a messy pile of shoes. It speaks of the very different individuals that make up our studio, but it also talks about a sense of common endeavour and common purpose. And when you take off your shoes, you strip away a layer. It creates a very informal way of working and maybe an informal way of designing. And there's a kind of subliminal message to clients as they come in the door and they're politely asked to take their shoes off, which is, you are not in for a passive ride. We're all in this together. And for me, that is incredibly important, and it underpins the culture of our office. And by the way, taking your shoes off also keeps the carpet clean. So I'm going to start with MAAT, the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology, which we completed in October of 2016. It's in the most fantastic site in Lisbon, the westernmost part of Europe. And Lisbon is a city whose identity has been formed through its geography. So it's a very outward-looking society. It's a very tolerant society because it looks back not just to Europe, but it looks to Africa, to South America. It's from where the great explorers set off. So it has this sense of outwardness. And yet it is also the waterfront, which is so extraordinary because it is facing due west, is cut off from the rest of the city by railway tracks and a 4-lane highway. And one of the first things that we did, the first kind of question that we asked ourselves when we started this commission, and it was, by the way, a direct commission, which is so nice, it wasn't a competition, was how can this building speak of the openness? How can we use the topography, the geography, to drive the building? And how can we, more importantly, how can we use the design of a building to reconcile a city whose waterfront is cut off from the historic heart? And you can see in this photograph also the relationship to the old electricity power station. So a very important part of Lisbon's industrial heritage. But here is this artery that totally bisects the waterfront from the rest of the city. But we resolved this by making a very simple move to design a bridge, which is a segment of a curve, which starts on a square, the other side of the railway tracks, and you land on the roof of our building. The bridge is almost open, not quite open. The building opened before the bridge. But this act of connecting it literally, not just literally, but metaphysically back to the city was a very important move and began to suggest a way of circulating on the building. It also creates a really significant new public outdoor space on the roof. And we have created additional public outdoor space by taking the steps down into the water, and at high tide they flood, so that there's a very kind of visceral relationship between the geography of the place and the building. And we had to also find a way to integrate an existing substation, which is below the topography of our building, which powers still part of the city. This is the opening. This is, I like to say, this is not the bridge that we have designed, but this is the bridge on the opening weekend of the museum. There were so many people who came to the opening that the bridge had to be closed because it was in danger of collapse. But I realized that we'd done something right because we'd captured the public's imagination. And this is the first weekend of opening. And what you see on the top of the building, it's not just planting, that's people. 80,000 people came over 2 days from a city whose population is less than 500,000. So it was a really extraordinary kind of endorsement of taking a radical view with a building, but being extremely sensitive to its context. And to see the museum not just as a cultural project, but as an urban one, and an urban one that resolves very complex and difficult issues of access. And the Electricity Museum next door is part of the Kunsthal, part of the art campus. We took a decision very early on to create a building that was very low-slung in relation to the power station. Partly out of respect for the kind of the muscularity of that industrial heritage, but more importantly, so that the views from the city would not be impeded by the building, and the views from the other side of the river would not be, looking back to the city, would not be impeded by the building. So it was, if you like, counterintuitive to put the galleries partially below ground. But it was that move that allowed us to use the building as a piece of urban fabric, to knit it into the city, and to create a sense of presence, but one that has a certain modesty, perhaps. The light that you get in this part of Lisbon is quite extraordinary, and it bounces off the water, and we wanted to find a way to capture this and to amplify the extraordinary effects. So this is the roof, which has now become a real destination in its own right in Lisbon. So it's a place you can hang out, it's a place in which you can look over to the river, or you can look back to the city. And it's one of the most popular destinations in Lisbon now. You can go running there, you can just hang out. But more importantly, you have for the first time a different perspective of the city, because it's a perspective that people of Lisbon have not had before, where you look back at the city because of this aspect that you get from the roof. So this is looking back across the city. So this is the kind of metaphysical link, and then the physical link with the bridge itself. And here you see it in relation to the bridge, and also in relation to the power station. So there's a very kind of soft relationship between the orthogonal geometry of the power station and the topography of the museum. And from the roof, at sunset, you have the most fabulous views. So it's a place that people just gather to take photographs. The presence of the building completely changes according to the sun, according to the time of day, according to the time of year. And you can see here how we've taken the steps down into the water to really just heighten its its siting on the edge of the river. And it's an extraordinary part of the river. You actually can see that moment where river becomes ocean. There's literally a line in the water that signifies the change. So we wanted this, having taken the decision to make a low building, it had a very stretched elevation. So how do we deal with a facade that's extremely long, but break it down into a series of tiles that have a human scale and that really will catch the light? So we worked very closely with a fantastic family business called Cumella, who are based just outside of Barcelona. We actually looked to work with the companies in Portugal, but they didn't have the technical ability to mechanically fix the tiles in the way that we wanted to. So we worked with Cumella, and they were, we're extremely lucky when we find a maker, a manufacturer who is prepared to experiment, who is prepared to explore the limits of something in order to advance the debate, perhaps. And these tiles are a little bit three-dimensional, so that sometimes the sun catches the edge, sometimes it just catches the front. And according to the geometry in plan, the tiles either match up or they begin to offset. And so you create this kind of textured pattern to the facade. And it feels very different according to the angle that you view it from. And this is the tile. They're handmade. And we wanted to choose a glaze that was very neutral so that it would pick up the sun, that it would pick up the changing weather conditions and give a different presence according to the time of day. And we also wanted to add a layer. So we added this crackle glaze because a crackle glaze speaks of history. And it creates a certain depth so that when you get close to the building, there's a depth that you can discover that you wouldn't otherwise be aware of. So at different times of day when the sun is bouncing off the water, and then this is what happens at sunset. It literally, the whole building turns gold. And the water turns gold. It is a really wonderful moment. And because the climate is so great there, you experience it many, many months of the year. And then as dusk falls, it becomes almost a kind of silvery black. What we couldn't have imagined and was incredibly gratifying is how people would appropriate and use this building. And here people are using the facade, because it's so long, as a musical instrument. And what we didn't design, but I wish we had, but now we'll know for next time, but we discovered it by chance after the building was finished, that if you stand at a certain point below the overhang of the roof, the sound of the waves are amplified in that moment. And it's a very poetic moment to come across it. But one of those really nice things, I could have pretended we designed it, but we didn't. But it's there. What we did design was this. And knowing how strong the sun was and how we could use that to advantage. So the sun hits the water, bounces off the water onto the underside of the overhang of the cantilever, and then down through a roof light into the galleries below. And this is during construction, but so during the winter months, when the sun is not so strong, we allow shafts of daylight to come through the roof light, which can also be completely cut off if a curator doesn't want to work with the daylight. Or during the summer months, the geometry of the roof light is such that it is self-shading and you just get indirect north light. At a certain time of day in the winter, you'll be able to see the reflection of the water on the floor of a part of the gallery. And then when you're in the gallery itself, you look up and you see the sky, but you also see the edge of the overhang above you. And this is, because this is a museum of three disciplines, of art, architecture and technology, where three disciplines coincide, we wanted all the spaces to flow one from another, for there to be no barriers, for there to be no doors between spaces. This is, as you come in, it's the big oval space. It was really for installations. And because the power station is part of the art campus, all the exhibitions here are site-specific and are designed in response to the spaces in the building. So a very technical ceiling and then ramps or steps down into this oval gallery. And this was the first installation by the artist Dominique Gonzalez Forster to coincide with the opening, where she put a net over the space so that the visitor becomes the protagonist of the space. And then smaller spaces off that space that are used for new artists, for exploring technology, and a room designed specifically for triple video projections, and a space that is called the Project Room, which is for up-and-coming Portuguese artists. And it has, it has become a very Instagrammable and Instagrammed moment, but that has certainly contributed to its kind of, it's in the collective imagination of the people of Lisbon. And it's not just the gallery. It's also become, in the year and a half since it's been opened, one of the most visited museums in Portugal, which is really quite extraordinary given that it doesn't even have a collection. So I used to go to Lisbon a lot and was always trying to find nice places to eat, quirky places. And one time we went and found this place called Sole Pasco, which was a tiny former fishing tackle shop that only sold tin fish. And there was something about this little place that just caught my imagination. And when we were back in London and we'd lost a number of competitions and we were really, just downhearted about losing competitions, and that, you all know that a competition is a huge emotional investment, a huge financial investment. And we thought, okay, enough losing of competitions. Let's invest in ourselves. Why not open a tin fish restaurant? So what started off as lunch became a project. So this is a pop-up restaurant in Soho that was open for 3.5 months. Badly timed, actually, because it wasn't the summer, it was the winter. And, you can't sit outside in London in the winter. But it became very much an expression of who we are. We sourced the tins. The dominant nationalities in our office are Spanish and Portuguese. And so through family connections, we sourced the best sardines, the best anchovies, the best tuna. And we turned the humble tin into an object of desire. And with our obsession with the V&A and vitrines, the window of the restaurant became the vitrine for these beautiful tins. And in fact, there is a place I've been to twice since I've been here in Boston, called Salty Girl, which has some of the tins that we sold in tin can. And so the shop window is the vitrine. And then we did everything. We did the furniture, we ran the restaurant. We kind of got a taste for being a little bit entrepreneurial. And we designed this light to showcase the OLED film technology, very thin film, and persuaded OLED to give us the film for free, and then we assembled the lights ourselves in the office with a view to turning it into a business, which of course hasn't happened. But we did, we got the taste for a kind of, self-generating projects. And I do think that, that I don't know what the system is in America as much as in Europe, but I feel that architecture as a profession, we're becoming quite marginalized. And the competition system is getting a little bit out of hand. So much is asked of so many people for so little money. It is not sustainable and it's not right. And so the more that we can generate our own projects and get back in control, and there's so much opportunity and there is so much money to do things. So to be entrepreneurial, this is a project called Pitch Pitch. We have quite a sporty office, and the team liked to play five-a-side football after work, but it was really difficult finding a pitch that was available. And so we thought, okay, well then we'll design a system using carbon fibre of removable, stackable five-a-side football pitches that can be put on sites that are vacant temporarily and that will meet an unmet need. And we've presented it at various conferences, and it's had a lot of traction, and we're now putting together a business case to see if we can't just generate our own projects. So it can go in any gritty urban site, or it could even go on the roof of a high-rise. And we're working with Arup, the engineers, and this has really been stress-tested to a high degree. So we're confident that the business plan will come to something. Talking of carbon fibre, this is a project, MPavilion. It's in Melbourne. It's Melbourne's answer to the Serpentine Commission. And the site is a really beautiful park in Melbourne, Victoria Gardens. And it felt to me, that to do a pavilion, it's not like doing a building. There's an opportunity to take a different kind of slant on it. And we wanted to try and recreate a tree canopy and the sort of the poetics of a tree canopy, that you would let some light in and dappled sunlight, and that it could also move in the wind. And that is you don't have that liberty of something moving in the wind in a building, but with a pavilion you do. So we thought we would explore it, and designed a system of a series of petals that we imagined would be in resin with carbon fibre, that was supported on very slender 4-metre high carbon fibre tubes, but all interlinked together. We had a hunch how to do it. This was the render that we did and presented to the client, but we didn't know exactly how to do it, and we didn't know who we were going to work with, and Australia is a very long way away. But on one of my first visits there to develop the project, we were introduced by Arup to a company called Moldcam, who started off in the nautical engineering business and were moving into using composites in building. And we were so fortunate because they were a partner who were prepared to explore this idea of creating ultra-slender petals with up to 5-metre span. So with them, we started to, through trial and error, figure out how to create these petals, because we wanted the resin to have a translucency so that you could see, you'd get this beautiful light under it, and for the strength to come from carbon fibre strands that would be part of the pattern of the canopy. These partners we worked with were so extraordinary. I mean, this looks quite kind of Heath Robinson, and it was, but this was to, build a very simple jig to wind the carbon fibre strands and then figure out the right degree of set of this translucent resin. And that was the really tricky bit. What they discovered was if you let the resin set too much before you put the carbon fibre strands, they would just float to the top and have no structural performance. If you put them in when it was too wet, the whole thing would be completely floppy. And the only way they could do it was to work double shifts from 7 in the morning till 9 at night to make sure that the carbon fibre strands go in at the exact right moment. So the commitment from this company was really phenomenal. And but we're very demanding of our partners, but we're very giving as well. And we received incredible commitment from them. So you can see these carbon fibre rods are actually developed for camera tripods, came from Finland. The resin, the translucent resin, came from France, used in the surfing industry. And you see here the carbon fibre spans, which connect each of the petals together, the ribs, and then the strands which give the petals the strength. And so you really do get this kind of quite dreamy quality of a tree canopy and beautiful shadows and reflections on the ground. And then at night it became a little bit more blingy. And all the lighting was within the cables of the columns, and the petals themselves worked as amplifiers. So it was a really great space for performances, and it was hugely atmospheric. Some projects really are kind of created and sculpted with atmosphere rather than through form. And this is one of them. This is a competition which we lost. I don't understand why we lost, but we did, for a mosque in Dubai, where the mosque and it's in the shadow of the World Trade Center, designed by Foster. And we wanted the whole kind of conceptual thinking to be about, kind of express this journey from the everyday to the spiritual. So it starts as a park, and the park then becomes the roof of the mosque. And really the atmosphere is through the extraordinary light effects that you would get through this aluminium self-shading structure, but that is calculated to allow light in where you want, and this great kind of moment at the end. This is at a very different scale, this is the building in Bangkok, which opened last year. The shopping mall had opened before, but the hotel only opened last year. So it's on the site of what used to be, or was, the gardens of the British Embassy. It was the most expensive piece of real estate to change hands. A 7-story shopping mall with a luxury multiplex cinema, and then a 35-story hotel, which is run by Park Hyatt. And we'd never worked in Asia before. And I was really keen that we would try and find a way that the building would speak of its place, and that it was something that just couldn't be done anywhere. The typology of the building has this, very typical plinth and tower, and we were very restricted by how high we could go with the tower and where we could do the tower, and restricted by the height of the plinth. And so it became, how can we use the form of the building to to integrate the tower with the plinth. And how could we use the cladding, and the cladding on a department, on a shopping mall, it's largely opaque. How could we use that, and it's a developer's budget, but to somehow reflect the chaos of the city and reflect the city back to itself. And Bangkok is chaotic the entire time, but in a really beguiling way. And so we designed a very simple system of aluminium shingles. There were 4 different tile types, and it's literally just a folded aluminium plate, incredibly low tech, because in Asia, the socio-economic condition is the exact opposite of the US and Europe. So labor is extremely cheap and technology is very expensive. So, how could we kind of play to that as a strength? We would never be able to afford to do this in the US or Europe, because the hundreds of thousands of tiles and the labor needed to fix them. But it meant that we didn't have to use a cheap standard cladding system, and it meant that we could create a kind of moire effect on this very massive facade. And then, having done this, we have to, the expectation, the kind of drama has to play out inside as well. And there are some great kind of moments when you're looking up through the atrium of the mall. From the biggest project we've ever done to the smallest project we've ever done, this is the ceramic table. And this project, again, came out of our obsession with ceramics. We were working on the V&A and the museum in Lisbon at the same time, both using ceramics. And I wanted to explore how could we design a sort of small, modest, ubiquitous piece of furniture, but through its materiality, change it into something completely other. And could we design and make a table in ceramic? Well, of course, our first explorations into this were they were really quite amusing. And, in the kiln, the legs would totally buckle. And it took us a long time to realize that we couldn't just use a typical ceramic. We would have to look at high-tech ceramics. So we looked to different industries. And there's Boustak, a company who use ceramics in the aerospace and the medical industry. And we used a material, silica carbide, which is an incredibly dense, strong ceramic, but wanted then, out of complete perversity, to change this table into something other, to apply a glaze that spoke of history. And the crackle glaze was a result of an accident in the kiln in the Song dynasty. And when they discovered it, they realized it was a thing of such beauty that they worked out how to replicate that. And so how could we apply a kind of artisanal crackle glaze to a very high-tech ceramic? And what is extraordinary, what happened when we did that, and first of all, the glaze would just kind of slip off. It took a lot of experimentation and work with our partners to figure out a way of doing it. But somehow the crackle glaze speaks of the kind of fractal molecular makeup of this silica carbide. And it was a real moment of revelation. Now, the only problem was that we went through 6 prototypes, and because after the table had been fired and nobody had jointed this, glued this silica carbide and then fired it again before, we got to the perfect table, but then it had to be glazed, and it was taken somewhere else to be glazed near Limoges. And while the final table that was going to be the subject of an exhibition was in the kiln, there was an accident in the kiln where the plate above the table just failed, the connections failed, and it fell on the table and smashed it into 1,000 pieces. So the table that never happened, but it was a piece of research where we were following our own illogic, and one day when we have the energy, we're going to pick it up and we're going to make it happen. And the final project that I'll talk about is the project for the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which opened in summer of last year. This is our site. It's between, on the right-hand side, the Henry Cole wing, the first building of the V&A, on the left, the Aston Webb. It's on Exhibition Road. It's it's a lost site that had never been used by the museum before. And the V&A is part of a much bigger vision by Prince Albert, Albertopolis, to have, if you like, a campus of 3 museums. So there's the V&A, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. And we wanted to find a way, how could we get how could that sort of idea of a campus that was, the 3 museums was to bring culture and art to the people. That was the original, the vision of Prince Albert. Was there something there that would inform what we did? This is the photograph taken in 1863 of Henry Cole, who was the founder, if you like, of the V&A, and his architectural and engineering team standing in front of the Henry Cole wing. And more than 150 years later, standing in the same place, is my team and our engineers from Arup. So we've moved on. It's worth putting this project into a little bit more recent context. So this is, you may remember, Libeskind's scheme for the exact same site. He won the competition in '97, but it was abandoned in 2004. And remarkably, during that time, it got planning consent, but for one reason or another, it never happened. And obviously I'm delighted, because otherwise we'd never have had the job. But for me, this building marked a moment, and the demise of this building marked a moment. And it was the end of the building as icon. And so when we were invited to do the competition, we took a completely polar position. And I wanted to speak about the iconography of place rather than the building as icon. Now, in the intervening years, the V&A had stated their brief and decided that what they actually needed was a vast gallery space below ground. But we took this to its absolute limit, but saw it as an opportunity to really reimagine the relationship between the city and the museum, between the street and the museum, because I believe very strongly that the role of the museum in the 21st century is to engage in contemporary life and to go beyond the confines of its buildings. So we took a very radical and rather daring position when we did the competition, which was to suggest that we open up the Aston Webb screen, which previously was completely solid. So this is, in the context, this is the street that goes from South Kensington to Hyde Park, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and the V&A. So you really, you see here the vision that it was a campus of 3 museums, but each one felt extremely isolated. So our first move was to take the street into the museum and take the museum out onto the street. But to do that, we had to negotiate a big level difference of 2 meters between Exhibition Road and the new the entrance, the ground level of the V&A. So we created an area of high courtyard that then just bleeds into an area of low courtyard. And this was about wanting to maximize the outdoor public space, to maximize the amount of courtyard, so that the courtyard could become appropriated by the public for any number of installations, for places to hang out, or for parties. And this was our competition render, where you can see that we had taken this very brave move to challenge the opacity of this Grade 1 listed screen. And Grade 1 listing is the highest level of protection that you can get for a historic building, and rightly so. But I think because there is only one thing in life that you can't design, and that is heritage. And so we have a duty to be incredibly respectful and sensitive to our heritage, but we also have a responsibility to breathe new life into buildings and to make radical propositions. And if we can do the same, to do both at the same time, then I think we can begin to move forward. So when we first went to, this was the screen before, when we had won the competition and we went to English Heritage and the planning authorities and presented our scheme, they simply said no. And, you know, well, they would do, wouldn't they? Because the presumption with Grade 1 listed buildings is you do not touch them. You just don't mess with them. So we went away. We did not change what we'd designed at all, but what we changed was the way that we argued the case. So we did a huge amount of research, and we had seconded 2 researchers from the V&A. And we argued that, you know, that this screen was originally designed to hide, and now the social imperative is really, it's the opposite. We must reveal these fabulous elevations of the museum to the public. But it was a very difficult argument to make, and then we found this drawing. And this drawing is the original competition drawing that Aston Webb did for the V&A. And what it shows is that screen was, although it was still solid at the bottom, it was much more open, and there was a garden behind it. And once we'd found that drawing, we knew we had the argument, because what had happened was after Aston Webb had won the competition and during the construction phase, same old, they'd run out of money, and the boiler rooms, which were intended to be below ground, they could no longer afford to have them below ground, so they had to move them above ground, and he redesigned the screen at the last minute to conceal the boiler rooms. So we had our argument. It was originally designed to conceal the boiler rooms. The boiler rooms have long since gone. Now we can go back to his original vision. So 9 months later, we got it. And it has had a very radical effect on the way that people enter the museum. The main entrance is in Cromwell Road, which is a quite busy highway. And there's a very grand entrance, and it's wonderful, but you go up a grand set of steps, and it feels, it's a little bit overawing. It can feel intimidating. Whereas this is a totally different way. You just drift in off the street. You don't have to go to the museum. You can hang out in the cafe that we've put there. You can just hang out in the courtyard, or you can go into the museum. But to create that courtyard, which looks like now very effortless, was an unbelievably challenging structural operation, because we had, in effect, 3 historic elevations that, well, we dug a very deep basement of 15 metres that wanted to naturally to fall in. So they had to be literally propped up with these massive props. And we also had to underpin a wing of the V&A while the museum remained open to the public and while its very precious collection remained in place. And we had piling rigs within 1 foot of historic stone cornices. We had to pile down 50 metres with tension piles, because when you dig a very deep basement, you normally put a superstructure on top, a multi-storey building or a high-rise building. But all we had was a courtyard. And so the ground just wants to lift, because all the earth has been taken away. The slab wants to lift. And Cambridge University, who work closely with Arup, came to the site and was so taken with the structural drama that they have installed fibre optic monitoring cables in the tension piles and the raft slab, because they believe that the movements that will be recorded over a number of years may disprove the elastic theory, which is the theory on which engineers make these calculations. And if that is the case, we will have advanced knowledge in a way that we simply couldn't have imagined at the beginning. And it's a huge credit to the V&A that they allowed us to, in effect, use this project as a case study, which will be published when the data is complete. So we have the cafe, which we put in the area of sun. There was a paradox that drove our thinking of this, and this is that, the big event, the really great moment, is the gallery below ground, but you can't see it. So this idea of how do we make visible the invisible became a really driving force in the way that we design, both at the kind of macro and the micro levels. So we wanted the courtyard somehow to speak of what was below. And the V&A is a very didactic institution. Its buildings are didactic, its mission is didactic, and its collection is didactic. Could we take that idea, could we literally reflect it through design, and in doing so reveal to people why things are like they are? And for me, narrative in architecture is really important, and it's important because it helps us to make sense of things. It helps us to understand. So this is an oculus that we designed that allows dramatic shafts of daylight into the gallery below if the curators want to use it, and the curators are incredibly conventional and generally don't, but I'm hoping that they will open their eyes to the potential. But this oculus does more than that. It also reveals the very structure that supports the courtyard that is the gallery ceiling below. And the structure of the gallery ceiling in itself is a huge piece of engineering, because it spans 38 meters, and it's a folded steel plate. And so what you're seeing here is that steel plate revealed. We've conceptualized it as though it's an empty museum vitrine. We painted the inside of the lining of the plate red in a kind of reference to old-fashioned museum vitrines that used to have red velvet. And you see down into the void of the gallery space below. And then on the inside of the balustrade, that is highly polished, it reflects the structure back to you. So you have this very kind of visceral reading of what is below. And because of the kind of the complexity and the evolution and the way that the V&A has developed over centuries, we wanted to kind of reference that as much as possible. What you see here is the redundant lift overrun from the Libeskind scheme, which was put in before the project was abandoned. and it'll always be there. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice to kind of reflect it and to, you know, so that somehow this building speaks of a very complex and rich evolution of design. This is one of the drawings. I can't tell you how technically complex this project was as a piece of engineering, as a piece of coordination, as a piece of reconciling historic fabric with new technology. But it was extremely difficult. But here we want to make it look as easy and as effortless as possible. So by creating 3 new entrance doors into the museum, we've cut through the stonework, through the fenestration. And by doing that, you reveal this really beautiful profile that you weren't really able to understand before. And it is a kind of classic case of through subtraction, you reveal more. You're now entering into the new entrance hall in the existing museum. So we opened up the windows, we let the light in. There's a completely different way. There's no big central entrance desk. The interactive screens at the back, and V&A staff greet you and ask how they can help you enjoy your journey. So it's this sort of idea of informality, which starts in the courtyard, is then played out in the entrance itself. And there's a very nice detail here. And if you can see, there's a great tradition in the V&A of marble floors. And we had to take up the mosaic in order to do the project. And so we kept all the mosaics, we washed them, cleaned them, and have used them to repair other gallery floors in the museum. But then we had made new mosaics in the same colours and at the same size, which we have relayed as a border, because these borders are very kind of traditional. But the border is a reflection of the tiles in the courtyard that I'll speak about in a bit, which in turn are a reflection of the geometry of the structure. And what was very, very funny coincidental parallel, the floors of the mosaic floors of the museum were allegedly installed by female prisoners in Holloway Prison. And the group, there was a cooperative that was formed just for this project in Italy, an all-female group. You know, as a filmmaker, there was a graphic designer who laid these mosaics onto mats before they came to be installed in London. So it was they're not in prison, but it was just, I thought the female thing was quite nice. And we did something else that was very radical, and again, nobody else, and none of the other competitors had done that. We proposed that the stair down into the new gallery below would happen within the museum. Now, it was much easier, and it would have been much cheaper to have put that stair down into the gallery directly from the courtyard. But we didn't do that for 2 reasons. One, this project was all about maximising the amount of free span gallery space below, because that's what the V&A need, and maximising the amount of courtyard space above. And if we'd put the stair in the courtyard, the whole courtyard would be filled with a kind of paraphernalia of entrance halls and cloakrooms, and but there was another reason, that we didn't want this to be seen as an extension. We wanted there to be an inextricable relationship between history and modernity. And by putting the stair in the existing museum, I think we create that. But to do that was far from straightforward. And we literally had to support the weight of history and underpin while the museum was still in operation. these new beams and columns, originally we had designed them to be white. But when I came to site, and I was just so struck by the enormity of the task that they were doing, that they were holding the weight of history, that it was very clear to me that we had to paint them in a colour that spoke of that kind of structural prowess and drama. And so we have painted them in international orange, and the international orange has a great provenance. It was the colour that first aircraft were painted in so that they would be seen against the sky. It's the colour of the bridge, the San Francisco Bridge. You know, it's a colour that has meaning, and you understand here, I think, this inextricable link and the kind of conversation between history and modernity. And we're able to, because this space is so vast, we've let in light, and it just animates the experience, because going down below ground can be very disorientating. But if you always frame views of where you've come from, and if you play and manipulate daylight, your descent feels extremely comfortable. And we have two stairs, one to go down and one to go up. And the reason for that is partly the kind of drama of kind of passing ships, but it's also so that you exit through the shop, but you do not enter through the shop. And my big critique of the V&A is that to come in through the main entrance, you have to go through the shop. And it's always felt a little bit, I'm a purist. I think your shop is the reward, the end of your journey, not the beginning. And then the daylight we play with, so that there's this moment when you get to the bottom of the stairs, there's actually more daylight than when you came in. So there's this kind of magic moment, and you're drawn down into the underworld by the light. And this is the folded plate that spans 38 meters, and it's an extremely technical ceiling that's doing a huge amount. And this is the kind of light that you can get. And depending on the time of year, it can be very diffuse, or it can be used dramatically to highlight a certain sculpture. So we've calculated exactly where the light falls at every day in the year. And it comes really, this kind of very technical scene from which you can suspend a car, which has all the AC, the lighting, the AV. It comes from a very kind of heroic tradition of steel and iron galleries at the V&A. And in fact, the gallery spaces that were used for their headline shows, which have now moved to our new gallery, are these two galleries that have had for years and decades suspended ceilings. So their next project is going to be to reveal these. So, you know, by doing our project, they then get two more projects. So it was a really clever piece of master planning from the V&A to have a very strategic vision for the museum. And then you've been to the show, you've seen what you came to see, and you're drawn up by the light. And as you go up, the views open up, and this sgraffito wall, which was done by art students, and because this was the original, Henry Cole building was the original Royal College of Art building, had never been seen by the public before, and it's been newly cleaned, and we wanted to frame it and reveal it as a moment. And we also, through the efficiency of the folded plate, we created a mezzanine level in the void of the structure, and that is where we put the toilets and the cloakrooms. So all of that kind of paraphernalia is put within the void of a highly efficient structure. So on a rather gloomy day, but this is the sgraffito wall that you see. And then to come back into the courtyard, this idea of making visible the invisible. How can the character of the surface of the courtyard, how can that speak of its place, how can we invest it with a character that could only come from its position in the V&A? And we wanted the courtyard to read not as a series of orthogonal tiles, but to read as a kind of colour field where the lines between the tiles become blurred. So we took the three-dimensional geometry of the structure, and we extracted from it, we flattened it, and we extracted from it a two-dimensional pattern that we then rationalised that would become the setting out pattern for the tiles. And this is actually the setting out drawing for the people who had to lay the tiles. So, you know, it feels like it was a difficult it was a difficult thing to do, but again, we had fantastic craftsmen who were working on it. But the tile, there's a story behind the tiles themselves. And the V&A has one of the most important ceramic collections in the world. And you know, I became very obsessed with ceramics and got taken around the ceramics collection by the keeper of ceramics, who knows more about ceramics than anyone else in the world. And it was extremely kind of humbling and privileged moment. And you know, how could we use that? We have to sort of use that access to knowledge somehow to invest in the courtyard. And these really beautiful Chinese glazes where the pigment pools where you have depth, could we find a way of capturing that? So we embarked on what we thought was going to be a 6-month piece of research, but turned into 2.5 years research. I just want to make it clear that the building was not delayed 2.5 years because the research took longer. We had the latitude in the way that the programme was phased, but that, you know, there was a moment where the V&A wanted to know what Plan B was, and could we design Plan B if this idea of the ceramic courtyard wouldn't work. And I said, no, well, we're not going to. You know, we're taking on a massive amount of work at our own expense to do this. But, you know, if it doesn't work, we'll just have a granite sets and be done with it. But we had to believe that we had the tenacity and that we would find the right partners to work with. And we did. We found a company in the Netherlands called Tickler, who are actually the oldest company in the Netherlands. And they are, again, a family business. And, you know, with family businesses, there's a different relationship between with your work. It's a much more emotional relationship. And you need that kind of emotional connection to persuade people to embark on a journey that you don't quite know where it's leading. And in Tickler, we chose them in the end because they use porcelain. They use porcelain on facades as a kind of faience, but I've never used it in a public courtyard. And in fact, porcelain hasn't been used in public spaces before. It was used in the Victorian times as kind of porches, but they were extremely slippery and just at a domestic scale, so you couldn't possibly do that. But there's something about the base colour of porcelain which is so much more beautiful and nuanced than a typical ceramic. It's got this kind of sort of whitish, greyish blue, whereas a typical ceramic is more biscuity. And these are tiles, 6 tile types, all made by hand, so that each one is slightly different size, and they're not rectified afterwards. They are parallelograms in shape because that's the pattern that was extracted from the three-dimensional structure. And by having parallelograms, you begin to lose this sense of orthogonal joints. And we further complicated that visually by putting a diagonal through the tiles and then having grooves in the tiles, because we wanted to also introduce colour and for the colour to be glossy, like that beautiful Chinese glaze. But of course, you know, glossy is slippery. So by having a thin groove and putting the glaze, all of the glaze was done by hand with a kind of pipette, your foot doesn't ever touch the glaze. So through a lot of testing, and we had to go through extremely rigorous process of getting this certified because it had not been used before, we came up with these tiles. And so you can see how white the base clay and the kind of subtlety of the blue glaze. We then thought, having achieved that, well, we'd just push it one little bit further, and we would use porcelain tiles to clad the cafe roof. And we thought, well, they're smaller, they're more straightforward, and we'll extrude them. So the die was made. And there's a reason you don't extrude porcelain, and it's because it doesn't work. So we pushed it as far as we could, and then had to retreat, and the cafe roof tiles are also made in the same slip casting. It would have just been a lot cheaper and faster to extrude them, but maybe next time. And then we had a different, because you're not walking on the tiles on the cafe roof, obviously, we wanted to play with the subtlety of the glaze and with a kind of reflection on the glaze, but the glaze was so subtle and the colour was so subtle that the people who were glazing them kept forgetting whether they'd put the glaze on before they put them in the kiln. So they had to spray them with this copper oxide to remind themselves that they had been glazed, and the copper oxide just burns off in the fire. But there's something about the kind of alchemy of ceramics and the process and the kiln that I enjoyed about that. And I don't know if you can see here, but you really, in the sunlight, you really see the subtlety of this glaze. So there's porcelain tiles there, and all this porcelain, and this is white concrete. Just coming back to the gates, and that screen that we opened up and altered. It was full of emotional resonance because it has shrapnel damage from World War II. And when we were trying, having got the permission to open up the screen, we were then faced with a kind of paradox of having to close it at night, because although it's a public space, it belongs to the V&A, the collection's priceless, it has to be secured at night. And it was the piece of design that took us almost the longest, because it was so hard to come up with a solution that somehow spoke of the gravitas of a museum gates, also that would allow you to still see through them. We looked at glass gates that would fall, that would go into the pavement. We looked at, conventional gates. Nothing seemed to work. We commissioned a survey drawing because we had to label and number each of the stones. We had to remove the entire screen in order to do the work, and then put it back in its altered form. So, and the stones that weren't being put back were stored for posterity. But when the drawing came back from the surveyors, they had mapped the imprint of the shrapnel damage. And at that point, we knew how to resolve this problem. So we designed the gates to be 35mm thick, solid aluminium, anodized aluminium, that are then perforated. And we designed a piece of software that would calculate the different angles of perforation, so that from certain vantage points, you would be able to see the imprint of the shrapnel damage that in the exact place of a stone that had been removed. And in that way, we're not just making the invisible visible, we're memorializing absence. And you can still see through it. And as you pass along it, it feels something incredibly modern and dynamic, but it has this kind of reference back. And you can see here that when the gates are open, you understand where that shrapnel damage was, because the base of the columns is new, because the structure of the columns is now completely different, having taken away the base of the stone plinth. And then there is a very nice detail that after the bombing, there was this inscription that talks about the enduring values of the V&A despite the Blitz. And we've got a new inscription that speaks about the reference to the shrapnel damage and how that can be read in the new gates. And then finally, we weren't asked to incorporate the Royal Crest. It wasn't part of our brief. But I was very struck by something that the then director of the V&A, Mark Jones, said to me. He said, no, you don't have to. But I just think it's important that we remind people of why this museum, and particularly politicians, why this museum is here. And it was something that stayed with me. And I thought, no, he's right. But this is a particularly ugly rendition of the Royal Crest. So could we breathe new life into the Royal Crest and to make it more relevant? And so we have picked out the Royal Crest. We've made it even bigger. And this time in perforations that are just perpendicular, because we didn't have to play with the depth of the shrapnel damage. So you can see through those gates, but you can read very clearly the Royal Crest. And this is to say goodnight. Thank you.
Questions from the audience, but while you're preparing the questions, I might start with one. Okay. I think what was really compelling about the work that you showed tonight, which was not something I would have thought about, is the way in which you kind of use bare minimum architectural elements in the two main projects. So a roof, steps, and an oculus in the case of Lisbon, or the flip, so a ground surface, steps, and an oculus in the case of the V&A. And I think this is really countered to the way in which maybe riverfronts are being populated or public spaces are being done, I think in America, or this might be a generalization, which is about packing of programs and kiosks and events and public architecture. So can you speak to anything of this kind of bare minimum, which...
Well, I think there are two ways really to answer that. One is about materiality, and I think I think there's a kind of there's often in architecture a proliferation of too many materials, too much discord, too many things coming together, and that the more reductive you can be, the more coherent a piece of architecture you can create. But at the same time, it's really important to add depth and richness and narrative. So you have to choose your materials well, that you can really mine them for what is there. But the other side of your question, which is to do with kind of urban spaces and riverfronts and public spaces, I really feel strongly that we should not over-design them, that you have to let what will happen, and that you have to see and understand how people are going to use the space and appropriate the space. Both in the riverfront and the courtyard at the V&A, we could have massively over-designed it. We could have done all the, benches, but we deliberately pulled back, and that's what makes it feel a very informal space, because there's very little there, and so you invest it with your own interpretation, if you like.
You seem to use surface texture as a very important element in your work. What does the texture of the surfaces mean to you in terms of the architectural expression?
Well, it's a way of. I think surface and texture is a way of playing out narrative. So, in the case of the courtyard at the V&A, it's this idea that the pattern of the tiles and it comes from something. It comes from the three-dimensional structure. It's an attempt to add a layer of narrative which will give you this kind of intuitive understanding of the sense, a kind of palpable sense of what is below you. So it's to kind of elaborate a story, elaborate a narrative. And then, you know, in the case of Lisbon, and, you know, why do we apply crackle glaze? Why do we go to that extreme, you know, why not just a plain white tile? Well, we had, in order to get to that tile, we had looked at maybe 50 different glazes, different textures. And there comes a moment where it just feels right, and sometimes you can't, there's no point in trying to kind of over-explain it. You just kind of have that intuition that that is the colour, that is the surface, that is the texture that is going to allow you to use this surface to amplify the light and to really root this building in its geography. Excuse me?
How do you compare the porcelain with marble?
How do I compare
Compare the porcelain with marble.
Oh, how do I...
What do you...
Well, first of all, we wouldn't have been able to afford marble. Porcelain, you know, marble isn't really part of the history of the V&A. The thing about the V&A is not only does it have a fantastic ceramic collection, but it also has ceramics embedded in the building itself. And that's part of its kind of, you know, the building as a didactic piece. And so it for me, it spoke very much of its place. It's not because I don't love marble, and I do love marble, but for the next project maybe. But porcelain is, although we associate it with kind of things of great delicacy and chinaware, it's actually an extremely hard, strong material. It's completely vitreous, so it doesn't absorb water. And it's harder than granite, and it's harder than Portland stone. So, you know, our associations with it are something of delicacy, but actually it's extremely robust.
Thank you so much for showing some incredibly beautiful work. And it strikes me that it has a kind of refinement to it that sort of very few other practices are able to achieve. And it's refinement in search of, or in service of, what I would call a kind of remarkable entrepreneurial spirit. So even in the way that you're describing the work to us, as though these buildings are instruments that are doing real work that the city can see, that you're sort of giving them something in exchange. And I'm wondering if this is entirely a kind of open-ended prompt, but I'm wondering if you might talk to us a little bit more about architect as entrepreneur and architect as sort of self-initiator, and maybe the kind of relationship that that might have to the sorts of forms that you're designing, and the search for a kind of very high degree of refinement.
Well, first of all, thank you for describing our work in such beautiful terms. It's really, really nice. I suppose, you know, what we're doing with materials is trying to, for me as an architect, what really drives me is to kind of to advance the debate a tiny bit, just a little tiny bit in every project, to move something forward. You don't always succeed, but to attempt that. And I think it's our responsibility as architects to do that, to make progress. So if you accept that position, then you have to take on a certain challenge. You have to form relationships with consultants, with makers who are going to go on that journey with you, because it's very difficult. You know, it was even very difficult with the V&A to say, you know, trust me, it's going to be fine. I'm an architect. We can do this porcelain courtyard. It's never been done before. It's not easy, and it took much. You know, so you have to collectively have a huge sort of self-belief that you can answer the questions that you don't yet know that exist. So, yes, if that's a kind of strand of entrepreneurialism, if you like. You know, I talked about being entrepreneurial in order to kind of get out of this cycle of a system that is eroding respect. And I feel strongly about that. And I think that large practices have the opportunity to do that. I mean, you know, we're a relatively small practice and we really push it and we really try. But if only the larger practices would get behind that, but they probably won't, because that's not how they make money. You know, they're driven by a much more commercial agenda, but which is an agenda that I'm not interested in. And, you know, to do things that have kind of richness and depth and refinement takes a lot of commitment and a real and commitment, you know, from everybody in my office. You have to be prepared to fail and fail again before you get to the point that you think you want to get to. But that's, you know, for me, that's the excitement of being an architect, and therefore the people that we attract to the office kind of, you know, they have that too, because it's where you get your feedback.
Hi. About more than 20 years ago, I listened to you give a talk in Cambridge, which was really impressive. You had like a double slide deck thing going on with 2 images. And I specifically remember you being very angry. I think about some of the things that you guys were trying to do, some of the things that you felt other people were doing that you didn't appreciate. And you hadn't built as much back then, obviously. And here you are, having built a significant set of work more than 20 years later. So, kind of joint question, do you still feel you are somewhat angry at anything? And how do you feel things have changed for you over these years with what you've been doing?
Well, I hope I didn't come across as too angry 20 years ago, because I really had no need to be. But it was, you know, when I started with Jana's Future Systems, it was a really, really slow trajectory. And I guess, and I know the point that you're probably making, that, you know, I used to put up slides to kind of demonstrate that we got there like 10 years ago and they're just copying us, and, you know, just trying to make a point, because it frustrated me that, you know, we were doing all this kind of advanced guard work and others were profiting from it. But actually, you know, so what? That's just life. You just have to be confident that you can be ahead of the game. So no, I'm not angry now, but maybe my frustration has shifted to something that I've already spoken about, which is that I do think the system that exists at the moment, the pressure to, you know, when you're going for work, to drive down your fees to suicide levels in order to win the job, it's wrong. You know, there are very few other professions that would accept that, and I think as a profession we have allowed ourselves for the sort of respect to be eroded, for our position to be marginalised, and I think it's about time that we reclaim that. The other thing that I'm really interested to reclaim, that isn't really answering your question, but is this idea of risk as a kind of positive force. And I know that the kind of litigious culture in America is you know, it doesn't exactly encourage you to take risks, but if you look historically, you know, that you can only advance by taking risks. And the nature of being an architect, you know, most things that you build are totally kind of bespoke, one-off, you know, and clients want that. They demand it, and yet they want it to be risk-free. So there's this real kind of built-in tension that I just think we have to be a bit more upfront about. But I see being entrepreneurial as something hugely positive. You know, that one of the biggest issues in the UK at the moment is housing, affordable housing. There isn't enough of it, and what there is so low grade, and it's just wrong. And why aren't practices like ourselves? Why aren't we invited to do something? Okay, we're not. We probably never will be. So let's just accept that, and let's create our own project. Let's find a group. Let's get people together. Let's identify the unmet need. Let's find the site. Let's raise the money, and propose something as a test case. So I think we can take something really positive from that and just drive it a bit more. We've become too much the passenger.
Hi. I have a question regarding the research work in your office. I've seen some of your projects are more self-driven of a research or kind of a research branched out from a commissioned work. I was just wondering, how do you balance that in your practice of the research work that you do and the commissioned work you do? And also, how do you think that benefited your kind of ongoing projects in the short term and the long term? And when do you decide to initiate a self-driven research or kind of a research derived from a commission project? Thanks.
Well, yes, in a way it's a kind of balance, but there's a sort of impulse to do a research project, a self-driven project. And if you try and be too kind of pragmatic about it and too businesslike about it, and can we really afford to do this? You'll never do anything. So we are. I'm sure we could be much more commercially successful if we didn't embark on these things and if we took a different position. But that's not the kind of practice we are, and we're not going to be like that. So it goes with the territory, and the rewards that you get are they're not commercial rewards, but they are they're rewards in terms of the satisfaction that you get, the kind of intellectual fascination of pushing something to its limits, and what you learn. And it always becomes, whatever you do becomes part of your repertoire, and it's something that you can then use again, refer back to, and each project you do, your repertoire gets bigger and your work gets richer as a result. So I think for me it's incredibly important to do that. But it's not really. I mean, the ceramic table was, in a sense, that was all. It was kind of perversely. It was a little bit perverse, but there was an impulse there that just came because we were doing all this work on ceramic, and how could we take that forward? And I'm not sure how we can, but I think we'll come back to it one day. And it was, it was a great privilege to work with these extraordinary people who work on aerospace projects normally. So it's part of our DNA to do this.
We want to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.